a beautiful community. We're going to talk about a new wave of Russian trolls that have been more prominent on both of my channels in the last few days. I've got that message from several of you. I went ahead and I checked in the back of YouTube in the analytics where I can look at comments across many videos at the same time. And I kind of agree that there's been quite a bit more recently. So I want to talk about it with you. And here is how I want to do it. I want to first of all tell you what I think is a Russian troll and what I think isn't a Russian troll in a way that might help us. I want to say a bit about why there could be more recently. I want to talk about the current situation and why we are especially toxic and polarized and devoid of empathy as we discourse in echo chambers on the internet about global politics. And finally, I want to say what new rule I'm going to implement on the channels to mitigate the problem. So first of all, what's a Russian troll? One of the biggest dangers that we all have is the tendency to say, well, you are my political opponent, I don't like you, and anyway, your views about Russia, Ukraine are inconceivably dumb, so you're a Russian asset. And when you say that, and I know that many of you say that, there is no criminal offense entailed. So all I can do is say that as a public intellectual, it would be grossly unethical for me to speak in these terms, for me to start calling Russian assets voices in the West who are, let us say, too soft or too misconceived on that thing that's in the Kremlin. So when we're talking about Russian trolls, we don't just want to overload that category in a way that simply puts our local Western political opponents there. And there's a real risk. I mean, I'm sitting in the UK, and I know that there are some people in this country who voted Remain in the Brexit referendum who think that some of their Brexit political opponents are Russian assets. And I am profoundly uncomfortable. I grimace when I come across that kind of categorization, because the bottom line is that it threatens our democracy to overuse such a categorization because it externalizes domestic problems that are being exacerbated by the Russians as much as they can do it, but their effect is very limited. And so what we're doing when we speak in terms of Russian asset him, Russian asset her, is that we are taking domestic toxicities that we need to address and going on as though we don't need to address them because it's just malign foreign interference that, if it were switched off, would leave our society unconflictedly and benignly intact. So Trump's not a Russian asset, just at all. Right? He might be a politician who Putin wants in power, and for whom it would be for Putin, it would be advantageous to have Trump in power, without any doubt. And for Ukraine, it would be extremely concerning to have Trump in power. But that doesn't make Trump a Russian asset. That makes Trump a democratically problematic domestic American political phenomenon. I think it's very important to see it like that, to see it domestically and organically in the first and the second and the third and the fourth and the fifth instance, and only then say, well, there's a recitation of Russian propaganda talking points there and so on. And even more disturbingly, potentially the application of them into practice. So when we're talking about a Russian troll, what we mean is somebody who is not an organic domestic political interlocutor, who is just misguided or really unhappy and wants to express their unhappiness in many comments on the internet, we want to say it's something more. It doesn't have to be somebody actually employed by the Russian state, but it has to be the behavior of somebody. It has to be behavior by somebody that begins to approximate to a behavior of somebody who is employed. So there are two paradigms for this. The first paradigm is just egregious recitation of Russian propaganda, not kind of, we don't need to support Ukraine. That's not Russian propaganda as such. It's a domestic talking point. But I mean, a talking point like making up things that happened in the Donbass that didn't happen. You know, all of this Russian propaganda about the supposed ethnic cleansing and genocide there. You know, where were you for 8 years when X and Y and Z were happening in the Donbass? That is, together with a couple of other signals, a good indication. And there is a second indication, and we'll come back to that in terms of actions I'm going to take later. The second indication is when the engagement is not organic, but looks like it's the engagement of somebody at work, which doesn't mean they're at work, but it's the engagement of somebody who is at work. So, for instance, you're not just coming in and saying, oh, I think Russia's going to win the war, but you're coming in and saying that underneath 10 or 15 comments under a video, right? And that contravenes YouTube ethics, really. You know, if I go over to a performance of Schubert by Sviatoslav Richter on a YouTube video, and I say, well, for me, this is a mischaracterization of Schubert and the performance is far too slow, that's okay for me to express in a comment. But if I go underneath 10, 20 comments that are under that video and say, unacceptable performance, too slow, that's already right, a transgression of ethics on this platform. And if I do this in the realm of politics, this is far outside the bounds of what we might call organic engagement. You absolutely have to give the benefit of the doubt to people that they can read 4 or 5 comments, get pissed off by each of them, and then respond in a much similar way. But there is eventually a threshold one crosses where it's just excessively inorganic. If you've left 15 identical answers, it's really inorganic stuff, and you are behaving like a Russian troll. Why is there more of them? I think that partly it's inexplicable. So let's look at the more explicable bit, which could be just 50% of the explanation or 30% of the explanation. And it consists of a couple of factors. One is that there's genuinely some fatigue among the pro-Ukraine internet. It's palpable, and channels that are very zesty, very active, are seeing a reduction of views of perhaps about 30% at the moment. So there is that. Now, the second factor on my side is that my health has gone through a slightly more challenging period of a few weeks than I would have liked, which has affected what I've shared and how I've shared on the channels. And that means that, the less I prime the channels, if you like, and the less I prime us as a community, the more visible minority voices become. And of course, I just want to say that when I'm feeling particularly sick, I'm overwhelmed with empathy for everybody everywhere who is going through very significant health challenges. So if you are, my love your way and gentle wishes. And the third factor is that I've spoken about the Israel-Hamas crisis and the Israel-Gaza, the Israel-Palestinian crisis. And there are two approaches that people in our algorithmic bubble tend to take. One is to avoid the issue like wildfire, and the second is to only comment on it insofar as it impinges upon the Russo-Ukrainian war. And if one just had the considerations of protecting one's platforms on YouTube, that's what one would do without a shadow of a doubt. So if I sought some kind of professional advice about how to keep, my platform steadily evolving and progressing, the advice would come back, well, at this stage, Vlad, don't go out of your way to comment on Israel-Palestine. It's going to damage the channels. If you had a regular community of 1 million, then you could get away with it. But as you are trying to, cultivate the beautiful community, at this stage, it's a bit dangerous. And I didn't have a decision to make on that because in my ethical state as a public intellectual, I simply cannot comment on the issue, especially knowing that a lot of you were feeling quite overwhelmed about how to go about morally grounding oneself with it. So there was no way I wasn't going to do it. But there is a downside to that, and that is that when I have these conversations, the algorithm does begin to throw my videos in somewhat different directions and expose our community a bit to slightly different, not much, but a slightly different combination of algorithm bubbles that contains different demographics. So that's, I think, undoubtedly another factor, a factor that's not a product of a choice, because I have no choice here ethically, but nevertheless, it could have just, as it were, created a pass-through effect where slightly different demographic balance is passing through the community. But let me say something importantly reassuring, because a few of you have come to me and said, look, Vlad, I'm seeing some comments that I haven't seen before. I've just checked the last few videos on the chat channel, and the like ratio for all of them is between 98.9 and 99.4%. So we're typically getting an over 99% like ratio. So when you're seeing comments that are disparaging towards the kind of dialogue we're engaging in, it can look like they're more representative of the audience response than they in fact are. For weeks and months, and now more than a year, on the chat channel, virtually every single video has a ratio of 99% plus in likes, which suggests that if there is an appearance, a preponderance of comments that seem to question what we're up to here, they're just not representative of the cumulative community response. But as I say, these comments can be more prominent if our videos are getting fewer views than they usually would, for some of the reasons that I outlined, from health to my jumping topics briefly, to a little bit of audience fatigue that's ubiquitous. Now, let me say two things about a crisis of empathy that we've got at the moment. And it's not directly to do with this issue of Russian trolls, but it's very important to put it on the table, because it's a sort of stuff that can make a perception of additional trolls being about more disconcerting. we discussed Mr. Zaluzhny's interview with The Economist yesterday. We are seeing a transition into a plausible scenario of a very long war in Ukraine. It's an adaptation for a lot of people's expectations. And outcomes are uncertain, war is uncertain, but we're talking about giving ourselves psychological clues about what we're likely facing. So there is this transition going with the Russo-Ukrainian war. Then there is this outbreak in the Middle East. And that too creates a situation where there is discombobulation, there is disorientation, a feeling of rudderlessness, even a feeling of ethical rudderlessness about how to go about all the discourse one comes across, one participates in. And there's a lot of toxic stuff one sees, right? Also, when people feel enormously emotionally involved or even traumatized, there is a process of infantilization, political infantilization that comes with that. And you're seeing a lot of people who seemed otherwise reasonable having profound lapses in empathy. You're also seeing extremely toxic abuse being poured on people who actually have integrity, whether they're right or wrong about what they're saying. And all of that feels difficult and unlovely, and as we often discuss, requires of you to put in the right buffers in place so you don't digest an excess of undigestible stuff. So in the light of all of this, I do appreciate that one becomes even more sensitive to the quality of one's informational environment inside particular online communities. And then there is something else. That's the second thing I want to say about empathy. And that's that, in my opinion, there has been a profound failure, and I don't want to be overly pompous here, so I'll immediately start with this with a qualification, but there's been a profound failure of moral leadership in the West on the Israel-Palestine, Israel-Gaza crisis. And by moral leadership, I do not mean the idea that if there were moral leadership, that would lead to some kind of better political outcome, or that it could fundamentally revolutionize the way, narratives proceed online. Right? There is a profound degree, for example, to which, unfortunately, Hamas is winning the info war instead of the other narratives about the rights of Palestinians and so on. So I'm not saying that moral leadership from important voices in the West would help with this, or would help with more constructive practical action being taken, whether it be by the United States or by Israel. But nevertheless, it's kind of scary when there's such a lack of moral leadership. And I think that what you do get as a result of this failure of moral leadership is the sense that essentially the West discursively has failed on two pillars. It's actually failed to properly condemn Hamas, and it's failed to properly hold Israel accountable for a pulverization of Gaza devoid of strategy. What you've often got is the one pillar without the other, or just chaotic mess where neither of the pillars were adopted. And And we often talk about putting two things on the table at the same time, keeping two things in mind at the same time. And often that's a moral requirement. And I think that at the level of the important voices in the Western world, we have dramatically underachieved on the kind of moral grounding that we needed to come through with on this. That put two feet on these two pedals. Now, I want to say something about implementation. My policy historically has been to exclude people from the channels for overt threats of violence or overt and utterly egregious prejudicial statement, racist statement, like really, really egregious, that even if it's not directed at anybody in particular in the audience or anybody or at me, if it's utterly egregious, I'd take action. And that could also include the most sort of unbelievably glaring cases of sort of inorganic pro-Russian messaging. Extraordinarily, on the main channel, we've had for many, many months a returning audience of, that's not what's extraordinary, but extraordinarily, we've had an audience of 250,000 returning audience. Here, the audience, certainly up until a few weeks ago, was over 100,000, which means that it's not the same group of 30, 40,000 that watch a chat. And in the last few weeks that we've had fewer views, so it's not the same 15, 20,000 that watch a chat. It's rotating. The regular community, that's a core, sort of 1,000 people tend to always come, but the others, don't watch all the videos. They watch a couple and then watch a couple more later, a few days break. But what I want to say is that despite these numbers, in the last year, I've probably removed about 3 or 4 people from the channel. That's it. So that's extraordinary, and it's a testament to the extraordinarily privileged cleanliness of discourse we've had. So now I'm introducing an additional criteria on the basis of which I will start removing people from the channels. And that is what I said at the beginning, what I call communication that looks like you're at work. Communication that is no longer organic, right? So to take a non-political version of what really only applies to political discourse, imagine if I go on Adam Ragusia's channel, watch his mushroom video, and I come up with some kind of criticism of how he talks about mushrooms, and I express that criticism in a comment. Totally fine. But even if my criticism is right, it ain't okay for me to express that criticism in a copy and paste mode underneath 10 or 15 comments under Adam's video. Somebody's watched Adam's mushroom video and they say, Adam doesn't understand mushrooms. Right? Adam doesn't understand mushrooms. Mushrooms are not being understood by you, the commenter underneath this video. So I'm looking like I'm commenting with a work hat on. And the point isn't that I'm actually at work and I'm working for some kind of mushroom propaganda organization. The point is that it's blatantly inorganic communication, right? And when there is blatantly inorganic communication, you're out. If you happen to be somebody who's removed that way, you're welcome to reapply via DMing me on another social media platform. But basically, if you express a pro-Russian position, you're very welcome. But if you express a pro-Russian position 10 times under one and the same video in a way that looks inorganic and repetitive and looks like you're peddling propaganda rather than engaging in discourse, you're out. You're out for the benefit of the health of the discourse of this community. So I'm introducing this rule, and of course, if you have moderation rights on the channel or on the channels, you're also very, very welcome to. Oh, I'm not sure you can actually. I don't think you can, as a moderator, remove somebody from the channel. I think you can just remove a comment of theirs. So maybe I take that back. I'll have to look into this. But certainly I will be removing anybody who comments by reciting slogans and sound bites, not in a single organic expression, but in a kind of repetitive tick, 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 tick regurgitation. That's going to be out. And that will clear some people. Unfortunately, that will clear a very, very tiny minority of comment forms that we may have seen recently. That's all I got. Lots of love.